I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to be looking at a MIDI effect within Logic Pro called Velocity Processor. Velocity Processor works a little bit like compression in audio processing, but instead of actually processing the audio, instead it's going to be processing MIDI data, the dynamic range between the quietest and the loudest or strongest performed notes that you've played over MIDI. And we're going to see two separate instances of how this can be really useful. Firstly, let's just listen to the track we're going to be working on. Okay, so big dramatic track, and what I want to do is to add even more drama by programming a part for these big, huge drums called taikos. Now, what you can hear in this instrument that I'm playing is that there's a big difference between the loudest, hardest velocity strikes that I can play and the quietest ones. Okay, so there's a huge dynamic range in this instrument. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform a part in, and maybe we'll just record 2 bars of it, and then we'll think about sort of copying that part or looping it. But we're going to see what happens when we can then process the velocity notes that we've played to maybe just make them a bit more appropriate for the track. Let's record them first. Okay, so what I've done is I've played in this part and we're just going to quantize it and then we're going to have a look at it. Okay, now if I open this region up, this is the part that I played. You can see the notes, and within Logic, what we have a chance to do is to see how loudly they've been played because their colors help us. The brighter the notes, the louder they are. So the red ones are super bright and they've been played very hard, and the green ones and the yellow ones are a little bit less strong. Well, that's one way of thinking about velocity, but it's not the most helpful thing in the world. What would be much more useful would be able to see each individual velocity separately. So what I'm going to do is to open up MIDI Draw, and what this allows me to do is to select note velocity as a parameter that I can actually have a look at. And now we can see the relative heights of each of these velocity strikes. So you can see that these two are pretty much absolutely at maximum, otherwise known as a MIDI position of 127 units. So the strongest I can play those. And then what we can also see is that the other ones in here are considerably less. And if I click on one of them, actually, we can see that this one is 71 and this one is 79. Okay, so we can go through and adjust these things note by note if we want to. But what I can do with the velocity processor is to ask Logic to do some of that for me. Now, this becomes useful if the distance between the quietest notes that I've played and the loudest ones is too extreme. How would I know that? Well, the loud ones would poke out of the mix too much, and the quiet ones would be so lost that they wouldn't be loud enough. So in other words, what I want to do is to change the kind of dynamic range, but of the velocities themselves, and the velocity processor allows me to do that. So what I'm going to do is to draw a loop around these 2 bars, and then what I'm going to do is to come to Logic's MIDI effect, which just sit up here right at the top of the channel strip. And the velocity processor is this bottom one here. Now the window for the velocity processor looks like this. Let's just close the MIDI editor and look at this processor instead. So what I've got here, first of all, is a chance to say, okay, what I want to do is to rein in the strength of the longest or strongest notes that I've played, or the loudest velocities that I've played. And so the first thing I'm going to do is to set a threshold point, and then above that, what I'm going to do is to limit the potential for those MIDI notes to get as loud as they were before. So what I'm effectively doing is saying, okay, well, whereas before I played a couple of notes that were at a strength of 127, they're now going to get pulled down in volume to considerably less than that, about 2/3 of the volume of that, or the velocity strength of that. What I can then do, just like if I was working with a real compressor, is I can actually add a velocity makeup if I want to. So I could take those strong hits back up to something like their full volume, and in doing so, I'm going to drag up the volume of quieter hits in the process. So effectively, I'm just limiting the range of the velocity values that I've played. Okay, so in real terms, what does this sound like? Well, if we set a ratio of 1 to 1, or 1 to 1, then what that allows me to do, if I take the makeup gain off, is to see effectively no change. So in other words, what I'm doing here is I'm using the processor, but what I'm effectively saying is for every velocity unit that the notes used to get loud, they're still allowed to get as loud as they were before. So this we're not really going to hear. Okay, so that's as I played it. Okay, so if we start introducing a bit more ratio, then what we're going to see as we play these notes back is that the loudest ones are going to be pulled down in volume. And that's because that first velocity that I played that was near 127 is now much quieter than it was before. And if what I then do is to use the makeup gain to take these back up to somewhere near maximum, of course, the net result of that is that the quieter velocities get pushed up. Okay, so if I like that effect and that's working better for me, but I feel it's a bit too extreme, there are two things I can do. Firstly, I can back off the ratio a little bit, and also what I can do is also back down the makeup gain, so we get a little bit more of that range back in. Okay, and let's compare that to the original performance without this processor. Okay, so we've got a much narrower range of those individual velocities. And what we should now find is that that part sits in the mix much better than it did before. So let's just have a listen through to it all the way through and just see how that part's now sitting. Okay, so that's one context in which the velocity processor can be really useful. But if you're working on very different music to this, the same thing can be true. I've selected a piano sound, which has got nothing to do with this project down here at the bottom. So if I play this instrument, this is the Vienna Imperial plugin from Vienna Symphonic Library. You can hear it's an amazingly broad-ranged instrument. It responds to velocity in a really broad way. So we get this incredible, strong, bright sound if we play strongly, and this very muted sound if we play very gently. And for an instrument like this, the velocity processor can be really useful. Okay, let's just record something nice and free. Okay, as a piano solo, that might be fine because there's nothing sort of fighting the context of these notes, but it's an incredibly broad range of velocities. And what I might choose to do would be to say, okay, I wonder what might happen if I bring in the velocity processor, just drop the threshold a little bit, increase ratio a little bit, and just begin to see what happens when I contain the velocities that I've played. And just to show that even more in an involved way, let's increase ratio even more, drop the threshold even more, just to create an even sort of flatter line than we had before, and then use makeup gain just to sort of keep everything much nearer the middle. Okay, so I'm willing to bet that those velocities would kind of mix more easily because the dynamic range between them in terms of the strength of my performance over velocity has now been really pared back. So in this video, we've looked at the velocity processor, which is a way of being able to apply a kind of compression to MIDI data. It's basically just squeezing velocity at both ends, pulling down loud notes, boosting the volume of quiet ones, just to make everything a little bit more contained.